Hi, this is Shamtoli Haq. I'm the editor of Law at the Margins. Law at the Margins is a social media website that brings to you and amplifies voices around law and social justice. We're really excited today to have a group of panelists working on a wide range of issues to reflect back on 2015. Has justice been served? Where have we gained some momentum? What is the work that we need to do for 2016? I want to encourage folks to go to lawatthemargins.com. You can see a number of writings by lawyers, activists, and scholars on a number of issues around labor rights, human rights, and democracy. Today we invited a group of panelists to speak to you, and I'm very excited to have with us police misconduct attorney Andrea Ricci, co-author of the report Say Her Name, immigrant rights activist Diego Sepulveda, Chicago-based activist who will be speaking around the educational issues and the organizing that's happening there, Toby Chow, labor rights activist as well as an activist around the boycott and divestment movement and Palestinian rights, Suzanne Adderley. We'll be joined by Jarrell Ware, who is a New York-based Fight for 15 activist. We will also be joined by Rajmanjari Pokharel from Nepal. Hopefully she'll be able to log in to talk about the Nepal earthquake and also the organizing of the Nepali community. And then finally, Adam Weissman, who's been working around TPP. So some of our guests may join us later as part of the show as this discussion. Just some words to our participants. On your left-hand, on your screen, there is an opportunity to chat. So while you're listening to each of the panelists, and also just before I forget, Victor Naro, who is a longtime labor advocate and immigrant rights activist, will be co-moderating this session. So as Victor is moderating the session, you can chat and also tweet any responses and reactions, and I'll be checking the chats throughout the entire time. At the end, we're going to invite you to ask questions, comments, and participate and share your own experiences. So with that format in mind, again, we have a group of scheduled panelists, some from Chicago, Nepal, all parts of US and the globe. Technology is great, but sometimes technology doesn't always help us. So if folks may join in and out during the time. So again, I'm going to hand it over to Victor Naro, who will co-moderate the discussion with the panelists. So thank you.
Thank you, Shamtoli, and thank you everybody for joining us today. And thank you once again to Law at the Margins. I guess I want to begin to my left. Toby, do you want to just share with us in a few minutes some of the challenges that that we've had, especially your work in Chicago, and then what lies ahead for us?
Yeah, so I'm chair of the People's Lobby, and we organize both in the electoral political system and we organize protests and whatever we can do to get some change here. In 2005, I'd say there have been two major high points in the fight back against, I would say, neoliberal politics would be the top heading. The first was the election in the spring, where we took a shot against Mayor Rahm Emanuel, who has been historically like the champion of neoliberal anti-working people politics in the Democratic Party. So he was running for re-election as mayor in the spring, and I think for the first time in I don't know how many decades, there was a major challenge to the incumbent coming in running as mayor. Chuy Garcia ran as the progressive challenger in the mayoral race and forced Rahm Emanuel into a runoff. hasn't happened in a long time. The background to why Chui was able to force Rom into a runoff, which Chui then lost, but the runoff itself is historic. The background to that has been a major pushback by a range of progressive groups, but especially the Chicago Teachers Union, which Rom has been attacking because he's been, in general, one of these politicians that likes to attack public sector unions. So he's been attacking the teachers union. He's also been closing schools at a very high rate, which is very disruptive to not just the students, but the whole community where the schools are closed. So that's led to, over the course of a number of years, a big pushback against Rahm Emanuel and his policies. And that fed into this election where Rahm was really challenged in a real way. So Rahm made it through that. However, as a part of the municipal elections, we managed to actually increase the size of the Progressive Caucus, which opposes Rahm's policies. So even though we lost the mayoral election, the progress in the city council, increasing the number of progressives there, I think is going to pay off later down the road. And so that was the first major thing, the election. The second thing that's happened since last month is the release of the police murder of Laquan McDonald from last year. There's a video showing that a cop, Van Dyke, shooting him 16 times. No reason. You can see very clearly in the video that Laquan is running away and is no threat to this officer whatsoever. The officers shot him 16 times. But then there was a cover-up, right? This video was buried. The city tried to buy off the family of Laquan to quiet them down. And the cover-up of this officer murdering Laquan McDonald, this young black man, certainly involved the superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, Gary McCarthy. I would guess, and many people think, it also involved the Cook County State's Attorney, Anita Alvarez. The State's Attorney is basically the prosecutor for Cook County. And I would also guess the mayor, Rahm Emanuel. So there's now a big movement to force them to resign. Gary McCarthy, the superintendent of the police department, did in fact resign. Mayor Rahm Emanuel forced him to do that. But now the remaining targets are Rahm Emanuel and Anita Alvarez, the state's attorney for Cook County. And there's been a lot of action in the streets, most notably on Black Friday, the busiest shopping day of the year. Hundreds of people turned out to the Magnificent Mile, which is the ritziest shopping district in Chicago, and basically shut it down. And a number of high-end luxury stores were blocked off and suffered a big hit on their Black Friday sales. And I was part of a small group that shut down, like a shoe store that in the Chicago Tribune, the store manager said they lost 40% of their sales for the day by his estimations. So I think that sort of thing where people are now targeting the richer parts of town and saying, look, you're now going to suffer blowback from the stuff that happens on the south side or on the west side when cops are brutalizing poor people of color. I think that's starting to open a wedge between some of the wealthy people who run the city and people like Rahm Emanuel and Anita Alvarez who depend on their support to remain in power. So yeah, I think that's an opening that we can continue to push at in the next year. And I think, yeah, sorry, I'm over time.
Thank you so much, Toby. We're going to get back to you during the discussion, but you brought up a lot of great issues. Thank you so much. It's Suzanne. I'm just going along the order, but Suzanne Adderley, are you there? You also. We're joined now by, thank you, Joelle Ware from 5 for 15 and Andrea Ricci. Thank you for joining us. Joelle, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
You wanna in a few minutes just go over your highlights for this year and what the challenges were and what lies ahead in your work?
Absolutely. Basically, I'm Jarrell Ware. Of course, all you may know. I'm the face of the campaign for Fight 15, Fast Food Forward. Little breakdown. 200 fast food workers in 2012 came together, and we just like, you know what, we fed up. We fed up with, the challenges that we keep having to go through, working for billion-dollar companies, unsafe work environments. We just got tired and said, you know what, we're gonna go on strike. And this is what we did, and here we are. We're in 240 cities now. We're global, worldwide.
I'm sorry, I think we may have lost Joel. Yeah, I think we may have lost him. So while he's trying to get back, Suzanne, I noticed you're back on the line on the video. Do you want to go over your chief highlights of the year, and then what are some of the accomplishments and what lies ahead in your work, and then we'll get back to you, Joel.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry, I lost reception.
That's okay, Joel. We're going to get back to you, Joel. We'll get right back to you.
Okay.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay.
Yeah, I hear you.
Good. Thank you, Chimtoli, for having me. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the developments in the occupied territories of Palestine and the movement in the United States to support the human rights of Palestinians. In the fall of 2015, we saw the development of a historic youth rebellion that some are calling the Third Intifada, others are saying it doesn't matter what we call it. What matters is that we saw sort of an unprecedented wave of youth resistance against the daily humiliations and the daily violence of military occupation. That one reporter, I think, put it well, that has no address, that has no particular party or faction to call as its leadership, and in fact is a youth rebellion that has rightfully sort of been critical of the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. And it has no address that can be sort of targeted, no address that can serve as the office or the place where the rights of Palestinians can be negotiated away. And the rebellion represented the reality of the Palestinian youth and their families, which is just an increasing inability to just live because of the military occupation. And so we saw months of sort of brave actions from young people of all ages spread throughout not just the occupied territories but 48 Palestine, which helped to sort of re-galvanize movements on the streets of Arab American, Palestinian American communities in the United States and throughout the world. And one of the biggest movements that we know of in the world to support Palestinian rights is that of boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. And I think earlier in the year, Chimtoli did a presentation, a webinar on that topic. And we've seen the BDS movement continue to grow and gain strength, as well as continue to sort of see a lot of attacks against it. But I want to talk about some of the victories that we saw in the BDS movement in 2015. The American Anthropological Association, which is the largest academic body in the country, recently passed a boycott divestment resolution calling for cultural boycott of Zionist institutions. And we also saw quite a new and a very significant wave of support among the labor movement in the United States for the rights of Palestinians through endorsement of various resolutions, also supporting boycott, divestment, and sanctions on a wide spectrum of analysis, but in the end, all of the support that was expressed expressed at its core the right for Palestinians to live freely in their land and to call for a boycott of Zionist institutions of varying degrees, and with the acknowledgement that the United States is the biggest supporter of the Israeli occupying state, is responsible for the suffering that is taking place, and also with the acknowledgement that the labor movement in the United States has also played a role since the beginning of the founding of the State of Israel, and it's also supporting the Israeli project of colonization and occupation. And acknowledging that role, many labor organizers, workers, and labor leaders have started to sort of express their dissatisfaction with the support of the labor movement for this Zionist oppression. And we saw the passing of a BDS resolution at the last convention of the United Electrical Workers Union, which is one of the largest national unions in the United States. Quite recently, we also saw the passage of a BDS resolution by the Connecticut chapter of the American Federation of Labor. We saw also resolution pass, I think it was earlier this year, perhaps the movement began in 2014, but it was earlier this year at the University of California local UAW union, and we're continuing to sort of see also efforts to support similar resolutions in academic unions, and in continued support by groups like the International Longshoremen Workers Union in the West Coast, who continue to express support and to encourage other labor bodies to look at their labor union's history with the State of Israel and sort of think about what it means to support Palestinian rights and how, as a labor association, they can do that. You know, and one of the reasons I think we saw quite an increase, I mean, sort of a new wave of this within the U.S. labor movement, I think, on the one hand, had to do with the slaughter that took place in Gaza in 2014, but also had to do with the resurgence of this movement for the rights of the black community in the United States, because what it did was sort of expose, you know, the institutional racism inside this country, and it was very easy to sort of make parallels to institutional racism that is exercised by the State of Israel, particularly as it occupies Palestinian territories. And that sort of brings me to the point of that I wanted to say that we saw a historic statement put out by black leaders in the United States and community members in support of Palestinian struggle. And the support that the black community has given the Palestinian community is not new. It's decades old, but this was a historic statement that was sort of put out by leadership like Angela Davis and leaders of Black Lives Matter movement, which is continuing to sort of, I think, help to provide this analysis of structural racism to the occupation that is sort of helping others sort of realize that it's important for them to think about Palestine in those terms. I want to then just sort of jump into some of my other work. For several years, I worked as an organizer for the rights of workers in the auto industry in India. And I continue to quite often sort of monitor with my friends and colleagues in India many of the struggles that are happening in the labor movement, both in the auto industry and in different sectors. And I think that one of the most memorable things that happened in 2015, in September of 2015, in fact, is when some 6,000 women who are tea plantation workers staged an 11-day agitation to demand better working conditions, to demand higher wages, and to say that we're dissatisfied with the very sort of patriarchal male leadership of the trade union movement, who they felt were not thinking of their leadership and thinking of their needs when pushing forth principles and ideas and campaigns for the rights of workers. These women led, as I mentioned, an 11-day agitation that resulted in winning a 20% bonus. It also caused for similar strikes to spread, and this was in, I didn't mention where it was, this was in the Munnar area of Kerala, in South India, and the women who began the strike are from a company that's partly owned by Tata, which manufactures Tetley tea, which is a tea we often see sold in the United States. So the activity or the agitations or the strikes and the work stoppages that these women began to spread throughout the country. And as these women began to sort of continue their struggle, they organized themselves into what they call a political party, or an organization of women that they call Women Together. And in October, national elections took place in India, and these women put their new organization on the slate for local elections in Kerala, and 3 of them won seats in local elections in Kerala. And they ended up being sort of in a position to vote in support of who would be the majority leadership in the state for the coming term. So it was very sort of significant to see women not only sort of challenging the conditions of work that they were subjected to, but also challenging sort of the leadership of old party type labor organizations and very sort of traditional, sort of conventional political parties coming together in strength to win gains for themselves and for other workers, and using that power to build what they call the beginnings of a green blood revolution. So they've become quite iconic in Kerala and in other parts of India, and that, you know, that's sort of a very sort of encouraging and exciting thing to sort of have looked at in 2015, for that to sort of unfold. It's sort of very, very, very empowering. I want to then just now jump into the work ahead, and jumping sort of back into work in the United States. I'm involved as, you know, I'm a global labor attorney, but I'm also, as you heard from the beginning, involved very much in movements for the rights of Palestinians. And along with that, movements supporting the continuation of supporting human rights in the larger Middle East and Arab world. And we, you know, we have gone through quite a fluctuation in the past 5 years, let's say, of ups and downs, where we see sort of very important historic movements unfold, and then see violence continue to also unfold in the region. And much of what we try to do here is to sort of respond to that in the framework of how the U.S. government is or should be involved in what's taking place there, because as we know, they play a major role. And the past week or two have been particularly challenging given the new spike in Islamophobia and Islamophobic attacks that we see happening. And it's quite a scary time for many people, particularly those who are active in this kind of work in the United States. But I want to just sort of make a comment about that. You know, it really feels that as far as the Middle East is concerned, that the United States is at perpetual war with the Middle East, whether that be, you know, plans to bomb Syria, or whether that is continuing to fund occupation or to fund despotic regimes like the Egyptian and Saudi regime. And so there's a perpetual state of war with the Middle East, and with that is a perpetual Islamophobic period of Islamophobia, which fits right into, I think, the institutional racism that is part of American history, but continues to sort of evolve to meet the times that we're in. And Islamophobia is manifested in many different ways.
Thank you, Suzanne. Let's get back to that point, because I want to get the other panelists a chance, and then we'll get back to that point of Islamophobia, because it's a very important. But thank you, great work that you're doing too. I really appreciate your work. I have Andrea. Do you want to go next? Andrea Ricci.
Sure. I'll try and keep it brief. I want to pick up on what Toby would. So my name's Andrea Ricci. I'm a Soros Justice Fellow, and my work over the past couple of decades has focused on profiling, policing, and criminalization, particularly of women and LGBT people of color. And so, obviously, from what Toby is saying, and I was in the streets, maybe at some of the same places you were, Toby, so I'm just sending my love and support to all my comrades in Chicago, that this has really been a year of unprecedented attention to abusive, discriminatory policing, to police killings, to anti-black racism as manifested by police, and it's really been heartening for folks who have been working on these issues on the ground, and at the same time really devastating because of the number of police killings and the complete lack of accountability that has ensued at the highest levels of government. Elements that have happened this year, I think after the uprising that happened about a year ago in the wake of lack of accountability for the killer of Michael Brown and the killer of Eric Garner, the president was pushed by the Black Lives Matter movement and by the movement in the streets in Ferguson, New York, and across the country to take federal action. And by doing so, he nominated a president's task force on 21st century policing that then, you know, did hearings around the country and came up with some recommendations, concrete recommendations for change, sort of beyond we need more training, we need more, you know, attention to community policing. However, so that task force issued its recommendations this year. Of course, they're only as good as the paper they're written on until they're implemented, and that is really what lies ahead in terms of the challenge there, in terms of actually making it a real difference. I think also, particularly organizing in Chicago, but organizing across the country, has pushed the federal government to finally think about the fact that it should document the number of people who are killed by police every year in this country. And I think they were really shamed into doing that by the fact that the Guardian started doing it for us, and that, you know, media outlets started doing the documentation because the federal government wasn't, and tallying up, racking up numbers of over 500 people killed by law enforcement this year. So I feel like there's been some real pressure on the federal government. There's also been some action. They issued a federal guidance on racial profiling earlier this year that expanded protections to prohibit profiling based on gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, which were wins. The losses were that the guidance still excludes entire realms of federal law enforcement, including immigration enforcement and anti-terror enforcement, which obviously affect large numbers of people. And so made it really quite meaningless. And Racial Profiling Act was reintroduced in May, and the sponsors were sort of pressured again by the sort of DOJ guidance to expand the protections that would be included in that legislation. So again, that would prohibit profiling based on gender, sexual orientation, and gender identity, along with race and religion and ethnicity, which again is a tremendous win, but only if it actually manifests on paper. So that is the task ahead, that after sort of 16 years of introducing this legislation, we're hoping it'll get passed. The last thing I want to point out too is to say that what I mentioned earlier, which is the unprecedented attention to policing and police violence against Black women and LGBT people, which, having worked on that issue for 20 years, is welcome and long overdue. And part of that has been manifest through the Say Her Name movement, and a report I co-authored called Say Her Name: Resisting Police Violence Against Black Women, but mostly through the insistence of Black women in leadership and movements on the ground, from Ferguson to Chicago to New York to across the country, that we're no longer going to organize the rallies and do the work and not have our experiences of policing and criminalization at the center of the conversation. And so it's heartening to see organizing in Chicago that that was the end of the people and push of the people, and a success of Black Youth Project 100, We Charge Genocide, Assata's Daughters, and many other local organizers there. We've seen attention from McKinney to Sandra Bland to roadside strip searches in Texas, Charlisa Corley, which Shamtali wrote about, and most recently accountability for Daniel Holzclaw, who raped 13 Black women. I think the challenge ahead now is to figure out how we implement some policies, some of which the President's task force recommended, that would actually prevent some of this, or that we, more importantly, reevaluate our reliance on police and law enforcement as a source of safety and understand them to be a source of violence, and reduce our engagement with them. So.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea.
I'll stop there for now.
That's an awesome work. Thank you so much. Joelle, I want to get back to you. I know we lost communication, but you there, Joelle, from Fight for 15? Okay. You can come back to us. Diego Sepulveda, Diego, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yes, I'm here. Thank you for the opportunity to be able to be here this afternoon, morning. I really appreciate it. I'm really proud of the work that immigrant youth across the country have been able to just be able to push forward. I'm part of a team here at the UCLA Labor Center, specifically the Dream Research Center, that runs a national internship program called Dream Summer. It's to be able to provide opportunities for immigrant youth and undocumented youth to be able to go to social justice organizations across the country and really push forward policy and advocate for social justice issues for which they are impacted. From 2011 to 2015, we've had more than 500 immigrant youth be empowered through this process, and they're really redefining how it looks like to practice self-care in the movement, immigrant rights, to be able to push policy forward, but at the same time be able to take care of oneself. And throughout that process, having a Healthy California project within the Dream Summer program that has released reports around health access when it comes to immigrant youth, the mental health aspect of being undocumented, and also the criminalization that happens in communities of color, specifically undocumented individuals as well, and really pushing for health for all and the inclusion of LGBT folks. I know I personally worked with Equality California here in the state of California to be able to put that voice out there, saying that undocumented LGBT folks also deserve access to healthcare, and making sure that the 1 million individuals here in the state of California are also able to access care. Here at the UCLA Labor Center, really proud of the fact that we were able to launch Dreams Deported, which looks at the criminalization, mass incarceration, and deportation of undocumented immigrant youth. And we've had a couple of our alumni, specifically Harriet Andrade, highlighted in the book, talking about her experience of stopping her father's deportation and being able to collect signatures. So really my work here is to really uplift and empower our alumni from our program, and really other folks like my parents to be able to take charge and be advocates in their own lives. One of the things that's happening right now, which is a big issue, is Daca and Dapa and how it is being held up in the courts. I was a recipient of DACA. In 2012, President Obama announced an executive action that would allow folks who qualify under the age of 31 and they've been residing here in the United States and came here after their 16th birthday to be able to qualify for this executive action. And what it did is that it provides protection for 2 years from deportation, and it gives work authorization. So with that, one is able to get a driver's license and be able to travel abroad under humanitarian, employment, or educational reasons. So that was in 2012. So far, roughly 665,000 undocumented individuals have been able to take advantage of DACA, uplifting them and taking them to another level in terms of being able to seek employment and different opportunities that were not afforded to them before. But in 2014, there was an announcement of the expansion of DACA to eliminate the age cap, which was 31 years old, and really other eligibility factors, and also deferred action for parents of legal residents and United States citizens. But that's being held up in the court. Texas and 25 other states filed a lawsuit against the Obama administration, really stopping the implementation of these executive actions. And so far now, it's come to the point where just recently on November 20th, the Department of Justice asked the Supreme Court to be able to take on this case. So looking forward in 2016, that's where that case is going, and I personally was a recipient of DACA. It was really amazing to me. I was able to move forward in my life and increase my advocacy as well, and now I was able to become a lawful permanent resident, which means that under DAPA, my mom would be able to qualify. And for me, it's really personal, and that's why I do the work that I do, because I want to make sure that everyone here in the United States has that opportunity, that we're using executive actions to be able to uplift communities, but then also fighting for the bigger picture. It's the liberation and the freedom and the justice of our communities for people like my parents. So moving forward into 2016, really, hopefully the Supreme Court is able to take that on and really define and kind of bring to light the visibility of people like my parents and our alumni that are doing amazing work across the country in immigrant rights, LGBT rights, workers' rights, really tackling social justice and saying that our communities deserve justice and fairness, and really addressing a lot of our issues. So that's what I've been working on this year, and that's the fight that will kind of lead into 2016.
Thank you so much, Diego. Very inspiring work. Joel, you're back with us. You wanna? I know you were cut off in the beginning, but I want to give you a chance to talk about the Great Fight for 15 work. Joel? Are you with us, Joel? I think we got we lost Joel again, so we'll bring him back on. But I want to give now a chance for folks to comment. I know everybody's doing great work in so many areas. Are you there, Joel? Okay. This is a chance for folks to jump in and comment on the great work that we just highlighted and we share with each other. I know next year is a big year for social justice work on so many levels, especially the presidential election coming up, and what that means for issues of equality and justice in this country and abroad. So there's a chance for folks to weigh in, you know, based on the presentations you just heard, but also seeing next year is that how all this is connected to what's going to happen with the presidential elections. Anybody want to go first?
Yeah, so we might want to ask each of the panelists to comment, how does their work reflect in the context of 2016? So maybe you can start again with Toby.
Sure. Yeah, part of what my organization does is we try to elect progressive people into elected office at all levels. So we're working on campaigns here in Chicago at the municipal level, the county level, and right up to the Bernie campaign. So let's see. If we go back to one of the most exciting races that we're going to be involved in is the Cook County State's Attorney Anita Alvarez is up for re-election next year. And she has, we've endorsed one of her challengers, Kim Fox, who's very progressive, wants to end mass incarceration, has some really deep ideas about how we can transform the criminal justice system. And so we'll be canvassing, knocking on doors, phone banking to support her campaign along with a number of other campaigns. I think that's one place where we can have significant amounts of progress on police brutality, on mass incarceration, and all of these criminal justice issues. And you know, Anita Alvarez is someone that we've been wanting to get out of office for at least 2 or 3 years now. We've been working for quite some time on a campaign to make some, we think, very common sense reforms to the Cook County jail system, which is the largest, I think, jail system in the country. And she has been deeply opposed every step of the way. She seems to be like ideologically committed to tough on crime practices. And when we talk to her about the damage that this does to like poor communities of color, her response is basically, well, me locking away the bad guys is how I am helping poor communities of color, and I care so much about these communities like you do, but this is how we're going to fix them, by intense policing and locking them up. So this is something she's committed to at a very deep level, so she's got to go. There are calls for her resignation. I don't think she's likely to resign. I don't think there's anyone who can force her to resign. And because she's got this ideological commitment, I don't think she's going to be responsive to these calls for her resignation, even if we do keep up the activity in the streets. So we're focusing on the primary. We want to support her challenger, Kim Fox. They're both Democrats, right? We want to support her challenger, Kim Fox, in the primary, get her out of there, and that should open up room for a lot of progressive measures in the Cook County criminal justice system. But we're looking at a bunch of other campaigns also, and we're a multi-issue organization, and I think it's important to connect the dots between issues of police brutality and mass incarceration and the structural racism in the criminal justice system with economic policies and how we have an economy that, in a political system that systematically disinvests in communities of color, and that's intimately linked to how people in those communities are then brutalized by the police and harassed by the police and locked away for very poor reasons for long periods of time. So we're supporting other progressive politicians, locally at the state level, and also we support Burton. He's got an excellent criminal justice platform, I think, and hopefully his campaign is still alive by the time we get around to the Illinois primaries, but we'll see.
Thank you, Toby. Joel, do you wanna? I think you might be on mute. I want to give you a chance to jump in. I think Joel, are you there? Okay. All right. Okay. So, anybody want to jump in? Toby brought some great points about what's happening in Cook County and how it has a national impact, and what lies ahead for economic justice, social justice next year, and how it connects to the electoral politics. But especially, I know Suzanne, you focus a lot on international work, and maybe you can. And then I had to cut you off. I'm sorry, but we were talking about Islamophobia and the impact it's having today, and you want to address that as well. Yeah, I'm having trouble.
I think if you unmute Suzanne, we'll be able to hear you.
There you go. I got you.
I was saying that I'm not speaking for any of the organizations that I work with, but I was an organizer for many years with the Arab American Action Network in Chicago. And among my comrades, we have been very supportive of local candidates who we feel are rooted in people's movements. And so we were very supportive of Chuy Garcia's campaign. I went to Chicago just to attend one of his fundraisers. I live in New York now, as well as their support for Chokwe Lumumba, the late mayor of Jackson, Mississippi, and so on. Even though we were critical of some of Chuy's ideas on policing and so on, but and it takes a lot for us to support political candidates, because honestly, as far as the interests of the Arab community, it's not easy to find a political candidate in the United States that is really even trying to sort of respond to, particularly in the national bodies, to respond to sort of the demands and the needs of the Arab Muslim community as far as foreign policy is concerned. When you're coming from a region where there's war happening everywhere and there's occupations that have been taking place for decades, for almost a century, and it's all very much linked to both the political and corporate class in the United States, we have the experience of almost sort of often sort of being apathetic at times, knowing that there's not going to be a national candidate who is really going to sort of help turn the tide where that is concerned. And we feel that that's just sort of linked to the American electoral system, and the American political movement as a whole. So we have Bernie Sanders, and he has a very sort of interesting domestic policy that he is putting forth, which many in my community support, as we supported Ralph Nader in the past, I think very often during other elections. But as far as the questions of foreign policy and empire, Bernie Sanders has been quite disappointing, not just around Palestine, Israel, but also around Venezuela and his endorsement of basically, the State Department's accusations towards the Chavista movement, etc. And it's not so much about Bernie Sanders as an individual. The fact of the matter is, the Democratic Party, like the Republican Party, is as intertwined in what we feel is a increasing U.S. empire. Whether that, and when I say empire, just to qualify what I mean, it's an empire that is not just about the United States government. It's about the U.S. government and its allies, and it's the increasing sort of global security regime and the increasing sort of use of violence and repression to acquire the resources of the world. And that's not just happening in the Middle East, it's happening in Africa, it continues to happen in Latin America. And because of the day-in-day effect on our communities and our home countries and our families, that's much more acute to us. And we often feel that the left in the United States is not too often sort of puts a real sort of nuanced platform around foreign policy out there, and for the sake of winning elections. And in this case, I feel that there has been quite a tremendous and inspiring movement on the ground in the United States, whether that be Black Lives Matter or that be sort of the emerging sort of low-wage worker movements throughout the country, or that like in low wage, and also like what we saw in Wisconsin a few years ago, and also in many ways are turning the tide also around the Palestinian movement, as I talked to before. And what I'm afraid of is that that energy is going to be thwarted into an election campaign, as it was thwarted into the Obama campaign, as the Wisconsin rebellion was thwarted into a campaign to reelect them to elect a Democratic mayor, which didn't succeed. And so I'm much more sort of critical of national politics, and I think we need to think about how to sort of grow an alternative sort of political platform.
Thank you. Andrea, Diego, you want to jump in, add anything to that? Or?
Yeah, I can jump in. I think in terms of my experience in organizing and being able to work with immigrant rights leaders across the country, is that even just looking back at 2010, when we had a Democratic president and we had a Democratic House and Senate, the Federal Dream Act still was not able to pass. So looking at 2016, it's really not about for me, it's really not about whether you're Republican or Democrat. It's continuing to agitate and continue to organize to make sure that we're not only holding the president accountable, but all elected officials, to make sure that we're addressing issues in this country, which for me are very real, like Islamophobia, anti-blackness, xenophobia, homophobia in this country, and really push progressive policy forward that will uplift our communities and create concrete, tangible change. So really, the organizing never stops and it continues, but really taking a collaborative, intersectional approach to building community and power across multiple communities, so we can push and really be agents of change in this country.
Thank you, Diego. Andrea, you want to add anything?
I mean, I think I would agree with both Suzanne and Diego that on the one hand, I know that the movement is seizing the elections as an opportunity to really push candidates on criminal justice issues, particularly, and really support that. Particularly now, there's a moment where there's sort of a larger national conversation around criminal justice reform, and traditionally, election years are when people sort of come to their most conservative on those issues in order to get elected. And I really appreciate the efforts that people have to push people further to the left on this and really urge people to meet and go beyond where the Obama administration and other administrations are signaling that they're going on this. And yeah, I don't hold out a lot of hope for electoral politics as the answer, and really think that our movements and building power on the ground are what really pushes change in this department. And so that, and was saying that sucked into an electoral conversation, but at the same time that we're responding to it and we're pushing the envelope around it, as Black Lives Matter has been doing, as people resisting Trump's Islamophobia and blatant misogyny and racism have been doing. So I think we can neither ignore it nor allow it to consume us, and use it as much as we can to build power in our movements and to continue to push the difficult conversations in electoral years, particularly the ones around mass incarceration, police killings, police racial profiling, and really make those a litmus test of whether we're going to support candidates and really ask them to do more than give lip service to those issues.
Thank you, Andrea. So I want to now encourage the participants on the video chat to ask questions or comments.
So let me, this is Shamtoli, just to, for those participants on your screen, there is a chat feature. So you can type in the questions, and I will field them to each of the panelists and Victor as well. So and then that's the way we can sort of bring your questions. You can also tweet questions that you have, and so we'll field them. So, and while we're getting some feedback as well, I wanted to actually pose a question to each of our guests. Each of you work in very specific issue areas, particular geographies, and but all of you, and I think sort of touching on Diego's point about working intersectionally and collaboratively, but at the same time, Andrea sort of mentioned that although for 20 years Black women have been saying that we need to pay attention to Black women, that it's not a recent phenomena. How do we both critique our movements to move it forward in a collaborative way? How do we actualize this intersectional politics? And part of the reasons for doing this Justice in Review for Law at the Margins is to move out of our silos. So are there some tools or suggestion or advice in terms of how we might actualize that? And I'm going to start with Diego, since your phrase kind of was the catalyst to that, and then sort of have Andrea, because I know that you've been working for many years around, centering Black women around issues around police brutality. And so, how have some of the tools you've been using? So, Diego, first, how do we do intersectional politics?
Yeah, I think for me the reality in the movement, immigrant rights movement is, and even LGBT, is that a lot of the leaders have been women, and a lot of the folks within immigrant rights that are leaders have been LGBT folks. So being able to move forward, through Dream Summer, we really talk about anti-Blackness in the LGBT and undocumented community, and be able to build that divide, to be able to talk about really big issues affecting our community. And then, through our Dream Summer program, being able to send these folks across the country to really continue those trainings and continue those conversations. And one thing that's really amazing that's happening this year is that there is an undocumented Black convening to talk about undocumented Black issues, and then being able to educate others about that. So it's really about creating spaces for folks to be able to address specific issues in the community, and being able to replicate that across the country. And I think as immigrant youth, and just for myself, it's not being scared to say, well, I'm going to step up to the plate, and it's going to be me that's going to create that change. I'll run for office, or as a community, we will take agency and lift each other up to be able to be engaged at a different level of politics. So while being at the grassroots level, it's also being able to run for specific offices and being able to change that, to talk about issues that really matter in communities. So really addressing them at the foundational phase, and then being able to build and scale up from there. I hope that was able to answer your question.
Great. Andrea, and then we have a question from one of our participants, but after Andrea.
I would agree with a lot of what Diego, how we build from shared experience. So I feel like in New York City, for instance, as part of Communities United for Police Reform, we were able to build across many, many, many different communities based on shared experiences of discriminatory policing, and then also building real solidarity based on where our experiences are different. And I've seen that happen in other places where, for instance, in New Orleans, Breakout and the Congreso of Dairy Laborers organize around the shared experiences of Black trans women who are not immigrants and immigrant undocumented day laborers, and how those experiences of policing can be both similar and different, but how people can show up for each other in real ways around those experiences. I think across the country, Asian communities have come together to really stand in solidarity around Black lives, for instance, and I think that there's many possibilities for Indigenous people and Black people to come together around shared experiences of policing, and also the very distinct and unique sort of driving forces behind policing both communities experience, and so on. So I feel like there's a lot of opportunities to build intersectionally, but it has to be genuinely based on shared experiences, and also recognition of how experiences are different and differently informed by our identities, but that doesn't mean that we don't show up for each other in those ways. So I think that there has been, that's part of what's driven the conversation around multiple experiences and identities around policing within the Black community that's happened and expanded over the past year, and I hope that we can continue to expand that conversation around criminalization, intersections between criminalization, deportation, immigration enforcement, and continue to really build from those shared moments of experience, and then also a really complex understanding of how they differ, but how we nevertheless need to stand up because they're connected.
Great. We have a question from Cynthia Flores, and I'm going to actually field this to Toby because you, I think, spoke a lot about sort of local level organizing. So the question is, how do you envision capitalizing on the 2016 election to push some of the agendas locally that you're organizing around?
Yeah, so we're a multi-issue organization. So right now we're working, I've talked a lot about criminal justice, injustices in the criminal justice system, but we also work on fighting against austerity, against budget cuts and environmental justice, and improving the quality of work. So, we throw down for Fight for 15, that kind of stuff. Yeah, so I think, so, we are involved in electoral politics, but we're very conscious of the pitfall in moving people's energy into that. And I think, for me, the major pitfall is that, elections are a time when a lot of people can get excited and think that, something can actually change. And then, they get involved, they volunteer in different ways for some candidate that is exciting to them. But then after the election is done, like, all of that disappears. And there's a need for organizational infrastructure to make sure that the energy that came together doesn't just dissipate the day after the election, and also to make sure that people are still around so that if a certain candidate is disappointing, then there are clear next steps for this organized group of people. So that's what we're trying to build here. In the 2016 election, starting at the federal level, Bernie, so yeah, I agree with the critiques of Bernie, especially on foreign policy and militarization. He's not great there. And I wish there were a better plausible alternative at the national level, but there currently is not. I think we have an opportunity, though, with the Bernie campaign to, even if he's not elected, and he still seems to be a long shot, right? Even if he's not elected, he is lifting up, I think, a lot of the issues that are important to building a broader progressive movement, a broader movement on the left that can bring, the masses of people together to defeat this tiny handful of people who are running this neoliberal oligarchy. So stuff like taxing the rich and having a large like public sector jobs program. I think these are the sorts of things that these are sorts of the ideas that we need to have in a higher profile in this country. In Illinois, at the state level, I haven't talked about this yet, but hugely relevant to stuff happening in Chicago is what's happening with state politics. We have Governor Bruce Rauner, who's a billionaire and is backed by this like small cabal of other billionaires, and they've basically flooded the Illinois political system with millions and millions of dollars. There was an article in the New York Times about this, I think. And they're like ideological extremists committed to small government politics and attacking unions, and all of their policies are like structurally racist. That's one of the major things we're organizing around, and one of our tasks is to build a movement around an alternative, and the 2016 elections, which are also happening on the state level, are an opportunity to support progressive candidates who have a clear sense of not just that Rauner's policies are wrong, but a clear sense of what the constructive, positive alternative is, and to create a platform and a vision that can unite lots of different kinds of people. So, like, one of my questions is, I spent a lot of time in the neighborhood of Bridgeport, which has a lot of like old school Chicago working class white people, right? And these tend to be like very supportive of like the police department, but is there a way to have a vision and a platform that can bring people like that on board that also addresses the injustices in the criminal justice system, right? So I think that's, and I think that's something that we can work towards, and we can use the 2016 election to lift that stuff up.
Great. So I want to encourage other participants to use the chat feature that's on your screen. It should be on the right-hand side to ask questions. You can also tweet a question using the hashtag #LawAtMargins, and so we can then field the questions to our panelists. I want to go back to this question of collaboration across issues and bring in Suzanne. I know that you've done a lot of work in terms of workers' rights issues here in the United States and then abroad. And in the last year, I can speak for my work around garment workers in Bangladesh and immigrant workers here. There's a lot of opportunity for our discussions, at least around solidarity. Solidarity through consumerism, corporate accountability, and all of these issues. And I'm wondering if you can share what are ways in which we can build some of those international bridges. You also talked about in the context of Black Palestinian solidarity.
Mm-hmm.
So what does solidarity mean?
Well, I mean, I feel that like after I've had this sort of wonderful sort of global experience in the past 3 years in India, and sort of a lifetime of interaction also in the Arab world. I feel like what needs to be built is really sort of collaborative efforts where our struggles intersect, and maybe that is solidarity. But and what I mean is that, you know, having been engaged in labor struggles to some extent in India, in the auto industry in particular, and in some textile and some food industries and some service industries, you know, what I had seen in my time, I sort of described as such a sort of staggering representation of like the violence of capitalism and neoliberalism that I hadn't even really seen to that extent in places like Egypt, where I had spent a lot of time, or you know, in Chicago, where I used to also sort of do work. But I did feel that there really was a connection in a lot of ways. You know, it's the same economic system that is sort of creating these types of neoliberal violence, but in a more direct way. You know, if we did a global mapping of these industries that are making billions of profits, whether that be automobile or that be food or that be tech, then, you know, that is a web that has a very sort of far reach around the world, whether that be, you know, the industrial area of Gurgaon in Haryana, or whether that be in you know, in Latin America. And I feel as if, you know, we have to sort of do that sort of like mental and sort of physical mapping of what that those industries are and how they're connected to sort of the financial institutions of Wall Street, and people here need to sort of see how, you know, the empowerment of workers in India or the empowerment of workers in Egypt is wrapped up with our own sort of economic liberation here in the United States, and you know, and workers do that to some extent, and not just in a way where we're trying to see. So with the consumer connection, that's a very important connection, but we also don't want that connection to be based purely on paternalistic feelings of trying to sort of help workers that we feel are helpless when we buy the clothes that they make. You know, there are plenty of examples of real empowerment and strength among workers in the global South that we should celebrate, and we should do what we need to do in order to protect that. You know, whether that means we protect the international laws that protect them, or we you know, condemn the sort of policing that criminalizes them, etc. So, you know, and I think that there are many opportunities, but sometimes the larger institutions who work up here don't, you know, I think a lot of that collaboration can happen organically, you know, among workers, among rank and file, but we are so often kind of trying to run the circles of the large institutions that kind of keep collaboration at a very sort of minimal level. So I think, you know, look at the sort of autonomous movements that are taking place, look at our community organizations, and we look at like where there's opportunity for more connections and more collaboration.
Great. So in the remaining time, I want us to I want to encourage participants to write their using the chat feature to share with us your questions. So we do want to slowly start to wind down. We want to end at 2. So the question, we've been talking about what are the issues you are working on. What are some issues that we're not focused on that we need to be focused on? So are there issues that need to be amplified as we look forward to 2016? Are there linkages or connections that we have not made around, you know, law and social justice that we need to be making? So why don't we have each of the panelists think to share, are there issues that are not being raised up? Diego, maybe I could start with you and sort of go through the same order. Diego, Andrea, Toby, and then Suzanne. What's missing? What are we not hearing? And I also want to invite Victor. Victor is a longtime immigrant rights activist, labor activist, also California-based. Also want to invite my co-moderator to share words if he'd like. So what are we missing? What are we not hearing? And I share this because law at the margins, intention is to raise up issues that oftentimes get sidelined, not even just in mainstream political organizing discourse, legal systems, but even amongst progressives. How do we marginalize communities, voices, and perspectives? So, Diego.
Yes, so I was just having this conversation with someone else, and I'm going to provide one specific example. But you know, we run this national internship program. It's a very diverse internship program, or fellowship, I should say. And we had more than 500 folks go through the program. And one of the conversations that I was having with one of our alumni is that the hate that's going on. So even with looking at Dapa and Daca, how it's being held in the courts, hate is continuing to grow. And these anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim rhetoric is, you know, these messages are continuing to be put out there. And in having that conversation, we were really looking at racial justice across different levels of intersectionality and just looking at what does it mean to be undocumented and Muslim? What does it mean to be undocumented and Black, undocumented and gay? What if you're undocumented, Black, and Muslim? And just really looking across the different intersectionalities, and we're planning some events to be able to touch on these different issues and seeing how we can work together to be able to push policy, create policy, push policy, and just really build a network and build some real collaboration in which we bring community, we bring leaders, we bring organizations into the conversation about intersectionality and how we can all work together to create a strong, powerful social justice movement. So yeah, that was my specific example. In 2016, something that I hope to focus on is just really attacking the rhetoric and building community along the way at all different intersectionalities and margins.
Great, thank you. Andrea, so what are some issues, perspectives that we're not talking, that we need to be talking about in 2016? I want to mention last year when we held this same discussion, unanimously, all the activists said that we oftentimes ignore indigenous communities, Native communities, and we saw that again in Paris around the climate talks. And so I just want to signal that because that is something that Law at the Margins is pledged to focus its attention on, and had a specific chat on that. So some of your comments will instruct us collectively what we need to be focusing on next year. So, Andrea, sorry.
Yeah, definitely. is that we're not hearing enough about Indigenous communities. We're not hearing enough about police violence against Indigenous communities. We're not hearing enough about environmental violence against Indigenous communities. And we're not hearing enough about just violations of sovereignty against Indigenous communities. I would also argue that we're not hearing enough about communities of people living with disabilities and people who are differently abled in all ways. And that those communities are not lifted up within the larger conversations we're having about mass incarceration or criminalization, or around immigration and deportation, and also just around violence generally. In terms of the areas that I work in, I'm saying that we're hearing about the experiences of women and LGBT people with policing and criminalization in ways that that are unprecedented, but that doesn't mean that by any stretch of the imagination that it's enough. Particularly because of the communities I'm in, I'm sometimes surprised when I go outside those communities and realize that people are still talking about mass incarceration and criminalization and policing as issues that exclusively affect Black men, and sometimes extended to brown men. And I feel like we need to learn to center experiences while also understanding differences. And so I would urge us to continue to think about physical violence and police killings affecting Black women and women of color, but also to think about gender-specific forms and sexuality-specific forms of police abuse in ways that we have not at all been talking about. So while, for instance, sexual rape and sexual misconduct by police is the second most frequently reported form of police misconduct, it's not the second most frequently talked about. And a lot of people just sort of discovered through the trial of Daniel Holsclaw that police officers rape Black women, which has been going on since 1655 when the first Black woman was dragged here in chains. And police officers also rape Indigenous women, and that's been a tool of conquest since 1492. And police officers and law enforcement officers rape immigrant women, and that's been a tool of border enforcement since the establishment of the U.S. nation state. And so that's something that we're not talking enough about, and that we need to talk about as a weapon of war, not only overseas, but as a weapon of war and of police violence here at home. And one that is wielded along lines of race, but also along lines of gender and gender identity, along lines of nationality, national origin, ethnicity, and so on. And then speaking, I think there's been unprecedented attention to violence against transgender people by police and by community members. Again, nowhere near enough. And when we talk about sort of the victories of this year around marriage equality, some organizations, LGBT advocacy organizations, are literally closing up shop because they think the agenda's done now. And it's by no means done as long as LGBT people continue to experience violence and criminalization and abuse by police and inside prisons. So while, for instance, this year there was a lot of attention to the marriage equality decision at the Supreme Court level, more recently in New York, in the Southern District, and for the first time, transgender people should be subject to heightened scrutiny. And now we need to kind of mobilize around that reality, and also mobilize around finding ways to protect transgender people from violence that don't involve necessarily the systems that are perpetrating violence against them, namely the police. And then I would extend that beyond transgender people to women of color generally, to immigrants, to queer people generally, and really start rethinking what produces safety for all of us in ways that are real and measurable and sustainable. So that's where I would point us as we go forward, and that's what we're not talking enough about yet.
Great, and I know that you've had just a phenomenal decision in New York City around the strict scrutiny around police violence. I think the Atkins versus the City of New York. I'm going to post that on the Facebook event page. We actually have about 9 minutes left, so we want to end up probably at 2. So what I'm going to do is ask our remaining Suzanne and Toby to actually shift us a little bit, and you can incorporate in that, what's missing is a very concrete action step for 2016. What should people be sort of doing, and that so Toby, you can also incorporate sort of what are we missing, what are we silencing, but a very concrete action step.
Yeah, so actually for me, those two go together. So the thing that I think is missing and the thing that I want to work on, and Chantal, we've actually talked about this a bit on social media and over email, but I think, and this came up, I think, yeah, Suzanne brought it up, the fact that we're like all united in this global labor market that's in a race to the bottom. And I think this is effect on like everything, like racial inequality, gender inequality, immigration, all of that. And the solution, I think, has to be global solidarity. And one thing that I would like to see a lot more of is, I think progressive organizing in the U.S. has to better recognize the potential for solidarity on a mass scale that's out there and to act on that. I remember, was it like a couple years ago when there were these big uprisings in Bangladesh and like unions were like going on strike and like just, I don't remember the numbers, huge numbers. Like we have not seen strikes of that size in the US in I don't know how long. But like I had to read about it in like Bloomberg Business and the Financial Times. Like I didn't hear anything about it through the left or progressive outlets. And that broke my heart because I was like, this should be a huge deal for us. Yeah, I think we need to figure out ways to organize more across borders globally. I think labor issues are a good way where we can find shared self-interest among people in different countries, from like rich countries like the US and in Europe and in emerging markets. I think I've seen that there's actually hunger for this, especially, you know, we have like a college student network, and there's a lot of hunger for more of a global take on justice issues among these younger people who are getting involved in organizing. Part of that is because there's a lot of like immigrant students, and you know, they're like, well, my relatives in Nigeria are getting screwed, and that matters to me, even though I'm here in the U.S. But also just because I think there's more of a global consciousness, I think, maybe among younger folks. And I also think like we need this growing wave of like anti-refugee, xenophobic stuff, these neo-fascist movements that we have, you know, here with Trump in the U.S. and you know, in Europe, with the rise of Front National and all that stuff, I think a global movement on the left is like the long-term solution to that. So that's something that I want to focus more on in the next year. Yeah, I don't want that to get lost in the electoral campaigns, which we are going to be putting a lot of effort into, but we also need to figure out a way to organize more broadly on a more transnational scale. I will say that Bernie, I think that, I mentioned this before, foreign policy is something where he really falls down, but there was a really interesting part of his immigration platform where he says that we have to look at the economic roots of migration crises, and the solution, he says, and this is what he said he's going to work on, who knows how, but he wants to make sure that use U.S. foreign policy to ensure that everyone across the world has the ability to earn a living wage where they are without traveling to the U.S. or to Europe and often risking their lives, right? I think that's he doesn't talk about that a lot, but I think that's a fascinating part of his platform, and I think that's the sort of political ideas or stuff like that are what I think need to take a more central role in progressive organizing. That's something you want to work on.
Great. Suzanne and then Victor.
First of all, I agree strongly with what everybody had already said at the beginning with Diego, and I would say three things. Number one, I think we have to ensure that we bring class analysis into all of the work that we do, and that's one of the reasons why I appreciate Bernie Sanders' presence, despite my disagreements with him and the party and so on. And I feel as if, those of us who think of ourselves as engaged in these sort of global movements for social justice and economic justice, we cannot ignore the global South, and that includes the African subcontinent. We can't use the excuse of the issue in the Congo, for example, being too complicated and not falling neatly into the way that we frame our politics and so on. The violence of global militarization and national security extends everywhere, and so does the violence of capitalism. And we have to learn how to sort of make those connections and create those collaborations. And that includes in policing, the fact that U.S. police departments are trained in Israel, the fact that Israeli technology is used both at the U.S.-Mexico border and the India-Bangladesh border and the Kashmir border. And we don't use those connections enough in the way that we sort of target companies, etc. And lastly, specifically for the work that I do, because all of what you said is important. I feel like, for example, in the Arab community, we really need to confront our anti-Black racism, which I think that we, is particularly because this solidarity really often is reserved for those of us who are in the progressive organizations and movements. And the fact that the anti-Black racism exists in all of our communities, and it's an obstacle to really integrating into these movements to support Black women, to support Black workers, and we end up in our same kind of like identity sort of based frameworks, etc. And so that's something that I think I'm going to be working on with friends and people in my community.
Great. Victor, I do want to invite you to comment on sort of what's missing and specific for 2016.
Yeah, just taking all this great dialogue. I mean, I've been listening to some great panelists, and I just think there's a tendency in social justice work to institutionalize a movement and not to let it flow. And what happens is then we see policy outcomes as the end game and legal changes. And I just always see we need to remind ourselves policy outcomes and changes in the law. I just still see those as creating spaces for organizing and community building to develop, because laws can be unchanged at any time, policies can be undone or limited at any time. So I just think there's a weakness in the movement sometimes to institutionalize it, to see the end outcome as policy and legal. And also I think that then causes us to become siloed and marginalized sector of the community. I would like to see next year, and I've written about this to Law on the Margins, courageous dialogue within the movement. How to prevent the marginalization of certain sectors of the movement that we ourselves do because we become so siloed and institutionalized, and how to really see policy and legal changes as creating space for community building and organizing.
Great. Actually, it's a wonderful way to end. We are at 2, and the amazing thing about having activist lawyers, organizers from different parts and different issues is that I personally feel like we can continue on. I want to thank Albert Garcia, who is the wizard behind the scenes. He is the tech producer for Law at the Margins. I want to also thank Victor Naro, who co-moderated this session with me and has been a regular contributor, is formal contributor to Law at the Margins, and thinking through Law at the Margins as a site for actually a collaborative intersectional approach to social justice. That's exactly spot on the element and spirit of this space, and so I want to thank him for that, and hopefully there will be more co-moderation or co-powering. I think if you read Victor's piece on that, then I thank the participants, which tends to happen on these webinars is not a lot of questions, but I can see tweets and reactions afterwards. This is recorded and will be up. I encourage folks to distribute it and share it with friends. We missed today Jarrell War, who is a Fight for 15 organizer around tech issues, and we'll have him on shortly. and two other panelists, probably Raji Manjari from Nepal, had tech issues, but we will have all of them sort of on in future panels. I want to thank heartily and with love and affection to each of our panelists, Diego, Andrea, Suzanne, Toby. This is being done out of your own time, generosity of spirit, and I think that every time that has to really just be centered, is that each of you come to this with enormous amount of dedication, oftentimes actually without not much acknowledgement and credit. And as a labor advocate, I actually am really, I just want to thank each of you for doing that. I want to encourage participants all to write, to share ideas, how we can make it better, and we will take all of this feedback for 2016. So thank you, everyone, and we'll be going off air. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.